Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is indeed an honour to be able to get up and speak today on this very important motion and the amendment that was proposed by the Leader of the Official Opposition. As one of the honoured roles I get to do is be the defence critic. I am extremely passionate about our Canadian Armed Forces. In previous Parliament, I got to be both Chair of the Defence Committee and later the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence. And I understand that the incredible risk that our warrior citizens, either in the Reg Forces or in the Reserve Forces, are willing to undertake to protect Canada. Everything that we hold dear in here, our democracy, our freedom of speech, our rights and liberties, are only possible because of the incredible sacrifice made by members of the Canadian Armed Forces and the veterans who came before them. I want to pay tribute to every member who is currently serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, whether they're in the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Canadian Army, in reserves or Reg Forces. I thank them for keeping us safe. We do not even realize, Mr. Speaker, the incredible efforts that they take 24/7 to keep us safe here in Canada. They are the eyes of Canada on the world. They're standing on the wall to keep evil out, and they're always prepared to go where no one else would go. They run towards danger. That commitment that they have is something that each and every one of us in here should pay great respect for and thank them profusely. I've been in contact with a lot of veterans over the last couple of weeks and months as the mission against ISIS was starting to change and the idea of withdrawing our CF-18s. And I can tell you that families of current serving members are concerned about their sons and daughters, their husbands and wives, wanting to ensure that they have the protection that they're entitled to when we're putting them in harm's way. Our previous government brought a whole-of-government approach in dealing with ISIS that was well respected by our allies. We are part of the combat mission with our CF-18s and our air task force stationed out of Kuwait. Involved our Polaris refueler aircraft and 2 Auroras doing reconnaissance, finding targets, painting targets, ensuring that we degraded ISIS. And it's because of that expertise and work and risk that Canada was taken seriously to sit at the table to make decisions on the combat mission. Our Special Operation Forces members who are serving with the Kurdish Peshmerga in advise and assist role, providing training, command and control, those individuals have done great work. And the accumulation of those 2 efforts really showed itself in December when ISIS mounted one of the largest attacks that the coalition had witnessed, when they overran Kurdish Peshmerga positions between Mosul and Erbil and were able to break the line. And our Canadian Special Operation Forces, along with the Kurdish Peshmerga, were able to push back and call in airstrikes from Canadian CF-18s and retake the ground. That is extremely commendable. The Conservative government also provided humanitarian relief, over half of it going to Syrian refugees, displaced people, providing food, water, shelter, clothes, medical attention, schooling opportunities that weren't there for hundreds of thousands of people. $1 billion spent in the region and over half of that going to Syria. And of course we expanded the diplomatic corps, trying to engage more with our allies, trying to find solutions in the region, and ultimately hope for a political resolution to the civil war within Syria. But what we're dealing with ISIS will not be dealt with through diplomacy. We know that. The Prime Minister, in his comments, Mr. Speaker, talked about that the most lethal weapon to barbarism isn't hatred, but is reason. I don't think anyone here expects the Prime Minister to actually go and sit down with the leaders of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, and try to reason with the man. We know that every hostage that they have taken who tried to reason with the ISIS terrorists have ultimately died at their hands. Brutally died, burning in cages, being crucified, being beheaded on camera for the world to see. We never can lose sight that we're not dealing with reasonable people. But we're not going after them in hatred either. What we're doing is exercising the responsibility to protect, which I think all members in this House agree with as a United Nations principle, that we have the responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. And we know that ISIS is targeting religious and ethnic minorities. They're targeting Shias, they're targeting Christians, Yazidis, Kurds, Turkmen, and numerous others, just because they don't share their twisted ideology. We know that they have gone after Sunnis who refuse to recognize their attempt to form a caliphate. And they've called them prostrates and have also they've executed them and persecuted them and ostracized them. So the only way we're going to be able to stop ISIS is it's an evil that has to be destroyed. And if you're going to bring a whole-of-government approach, diplomacy, humanitarian aid, training, institution building, you have to have combat. Canada has always lifted our fair share. We have always punched above our weight. And we have a reputation around the world for being there for the most vulnerable, for stepping in to stop atrocities. And it behooves me to understand why now would we step back? Why would we retreat from a combat mission that our soldiers and our air crew and our sailors are so well trained for? Yes, they can do peacekeeping. Yes, they do peacemaking. But first and foremost, they're warriors. We train them to fight. And I can tell you that everybody that I talk to in the armed forces, regardless of their discipline, understand that fundamental more than anything else. Defense of our country, defense of our society, protecting the most vulnerable. And Canada's always acted as an ally, as a partner in a coalition. We've never gone out single-handedly trying to change the geopolitics in any part of the world. And because of our strong relationship with our allies, we need to be more engaged. We have not heard a single good reason from the government, from the Prime Minister, from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, from the Minister of Defense, on why we have to stop bombing. The jets are already there. The resources are in place. The costs are accounted for. And the impact has been significant. We are the 5th largest contributor to airstrikes. We actually fly more than our fair share of the sorties. About 10% of the sorties are actually being flown by Canadian jets. And we need to keep those things in mind as we look at the reports coming out, how ISIS is being degraded, how they're now on the run, how just in the last 4 to 6 weeks, they've had to start cutting back how much they're paying their staff, their terrorists, their ISIS fighters that are fighting with our guys. You know, those salaries are one of the reasons that the ISIS team has held together. But now, because oil supplies have been cut off, they haven't got a way to get their oil to a black market. Infrastructure has been degraded. Supply lines bringing in guns, ammunition, arms, and food has really been disrupt, Mr. Speaker. So there isn't the capability for ISIS to continue their prolonged war, other than living off their own genocidal views. So now that we've got them on the run, this is a time to hit them even harder. Now, we keep talking that it's going to take boots on the ground. We understand that. That's why we first put in our special operation forces to train the Kurdish Peshmerga, a reliable ally with boots on the ground who are prepared not only to hold the line for the Kurdistan regional government in northern Iraq, but to push back and retake cities that have been lost to ISIS. We've got a major offensive coming this spring, and we want to ensure that we can take Mosul. And that's where the Special Operation Forces come into play. So yes, we support the increased training mission to enable more of those boots on the ground. We're doing that in concert with other allies, like the British and the Americans. And ultimately, the street fighting is going to be done on the ground. But we still have to maintain that air support to protect our troops, first and foremost, as we witnessed in December. The rules of engagement are something that I think all of us don't always appreciate or understand. But the one thing that we have to look at is how airstrikes, or how the coalition Air Force operates together. And every country always maintains within their rules of engagement the first and foremost responsibility is protection of their own troops. And so if ISIS decided to mount a large counteroffensive and against numerous different fighting positions in whatever reason they had, but thought that they can retake territory, we should be, if our troops got into trouble, our CF-18s would be there to provide that air cover first and foremost. We know what happens when other air crews sometimes are in the region. The minister talks a lot about mistakes of the past. He's been to Afghanistan on numerous occasions as a soldier, as a commander, as a leader, and has witnessed some of those mistakes of the past. I'd like to remind the House, Mr. Speaker, about 2002, when a U.S. Air Force jet, an F-15, dropped a 500-pound bomb on Canadians, mistaking them for the Taliban. That resulted in the death of 4 Canadian soldiers, and another 8 were seriously injured. 2006, Canadian troops were actually just at camp and were burning garbage, and a U.S. Army jet, an A-10 Warthog, actually thought it was disorientated time of day and opened guns on the Canadians, killing 1 Canadian soldier. We never can diminish the importance of having direct communication between Canadian jets and Canadian troops on the ground. Now, our troops are not principal combatants, but we've already witnessed them coming under fire on numerous occasions. And for that reason alone, I urge the government to rethink pulling out our CF-18s so that they can be there to provide that safe, close air protection that our troops deserve. We're tripling the number of trainers, 220. General Vance has said that's increasing the risk. So it becomes even more important that we maintain our 6 F-18s, CF-18s in the fight. You know, the one thing that if you look, Mr. Speaker, at this motion, and you look at the announcement, there's still details that are lacking. After the announcement, it came to bear that we're bringing in some Griffin helicopters. And we're still not sure. Are they armed up or are they going to be unarmed? Are they there for close combat support or are they just there to transport, to evacuate in case the need is there, medical assistance and lifting to hospitals? Or is it just there to make sure that we can move people around without being exposed to improvised explosive devices along roadways, which lesson learned in Afghanistan was one of the places where we saw so many of our troops injured and killed was because of those roadside bombs. So we need to know exactly what that squadron of Griffin helicopters are going to be doing. We need to know exactly, we talk about the intelligence gathering, which we welcome. We talk about, Mr. Speaker, the increased medical training, which Canada has a great reputation of doing, and we're doing it not just in, and I should make a point of this, that what the mission is doing now, what Canada is doing in Iraq is very similar to what we're also doing in Ukraine. It is strictly a training mission. So training medical trainers, training principal combatants on how to engage with the enemy, providing command and control, and advise and assist. So it isn't a combat mission in a traditional sense anymore. And the rules of engagement for our troops on the ground are the same as if they were peacekeepers. If they're sitting in Bosnia or Rwanda, if they're fired upon, they have every right to protect themselves, Mr. Speaker. And so, and the arms that they carry are very much for that specific purpose, self-defense. So, we still need to really look at the entire mission, and that's why, if you look at our reputation on the world stage, it has diminished. We're not sitting at the main table anymore and making the decisions on where our troops are going to be stationed, how we bring the offensive back against ISIS, retaking cities like Mosul, and ultimately crushing the enemy. And I just want to say this, we hear the quotes coming from the government about what they feel has been, congratulations for a job well done. And I think everybody that is here understands that there is the discussion that happens in public, the niceties, the civility that expressed between friends and allies, like the parliamentary secretary I always have. But I can tell you that, there's others that know better, that there is been comments made. I've heard them from people in the State Department, in the U.S., the Department of Defense, and they aren't happy that we're not carrying our load on the combat mission. Matthew Fisher, a senior foreign correspondent, actually characterized it this way. He says, to think that our friends or allies are happy about us pulling our CF-18s is hogwash. And, retired Major General David Fraser said, if we don't have our fighter jets, we're not going to have much of a voice. We don't get much recognition strategically at the political level. We are going to lose here. You will not win this campaign with only airstrikes, he went on to say, but you certainly won't without them. So Canada has a role. We have some of the best pilots in the world. The CF-18s have been upgraded. They have the best technological equipment. There's only a few countries can do what Canadian CF-18 jets can do in targeting and reducing and eliminating. We aren't even aware of any CF-18 bomber strikes having any civilian casualties associated with them. They've always gone at the target, destroying pipeline or destroying infrastructure, destroying fighting positions, destroying training grounds, destroying weapon caches. And just want to close with this, Madam Speaker. I know the Liberals really listen to some of their patriarchs of the party. And John Manley, who I think many people in here have a lot of respect for, and he said it this way. He says, as I said before, if you want to sit at the table, and when the waiter arrives with the bill, you excuse yourself to go to the washroom. He says, we've been doing just that and trading in our Personian reputation rather than fulfilling the Personian vision. Madam Speaker, I ask the government to rethink their overall mission and leave the CF-18s in the fight. And again, I just want to say thank you to every member of the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly those like our Special Operation Forces and our Air Task Force members, including our CF-18 pilots. All the best. They're in our thoughts and prayers, and Godspeed.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member from St. John, Rothsay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to member opposite for his passionate speech, and I certainly respect and appreciate the passion that you gave it. But, Madam Speaker, let me put it in these terms. For those of you who didn't know, I was involved with the St. John Sea Dogs, a hockey team, prior to my life in politics. And as a hockey team, if we're playing against another team, we would have a certain approach. So, for example, Madam Speaker, if we played against the Moncton Wildcats, we would play one way. If we played against the Gatineau Olympic, we would play another way. The best way to defeat an opponent, Madam Speaker, is to use your strength. It's to assess the situation, and it's not always, Madam Speaker, the same approach that works. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So I guess my question to the member opposite is, do you not appreciate and respect that we as a government are doing what we think is the best way for us to defeat an opponent? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank the member for his question. And, you know, if you want to use a hockey analogy, you know, if I was coaching the Edmonton Oilers, you know, back when Gretzky was playing, I had a lot of different weapons on the ice, and I used them all. Well, the Canadian Armed Forces has incredible capabilities, incredible skill. They're trained, they're ready, and taking the CF-18 off the ice would be just like pulling Gretzky out of the game.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member from Kootenay, Columbia. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for his well-stated support for our armed forces and to the Liberal government for bringing this question to the floor. I do have a question, though, for our honourable member. Can the member explain why they believe that bombing works, given the examples we have from the region that indicate this does not, in fact, contribute to a peaceful outcome, but it does contribute to the refugee crisis?
The honourable member from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Well, Madam Speaker, I just ask that the member not confuse the indiscriminate bombing that's taking place right now by the Russian Federation. This past week, we've seen some despicable attacks by Russian fighter jets on hospitals where Doctors Without Borders are operating. We see huge civilian casualties occurring and adding to the refugee crisis and the migration of refugees to Europe. And there's some speculation that maybe some of that is done intentionally to destabilize the coalition and our European allies. The Canadian fighter jets have been very successful in targeting ISIS only. ISIS terrorists, their fighters, their commanders. We've seen coalition fighter jets have taken out many of the ISIS leaders. And it's because of that we should be leaving our CF-18s in, to degrade the ability of ISIS to continue their spread of terrorism. If we got rid of ISIS, then we can probably deal with the civil war within the Syrian context, with the Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad, with the Syrian Free Army, with the PKK, with all the other groups that are involved in the Syrian conflict. But you can't sit down, and this again is President Putin, you know, going out there negotiating a peace deal with the United States on Syria, and then not honoring that peace agreement. And we just witnessed that twice on the Minsk peace agreement with Ukraine, where again Russia refuses to honor the commitments that they make during the negotiations.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member from Calgary, Forest Lawn. Is it?
Beauport-Limoilou.
Oh, excuse, juste à côté. Beauport-Limoilou.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'aimerais remercier également mon collègue pour son discours de qualité. Puis également, je voudrais reconnaître le fait que le gouvernement amène ce débat dans cette Chambre et poursuit la tradition entamée par le gouvernement conservateur précédent. Ceci étant dit, j'ai été surpris par une des affirmations du ministre des Affaires extérieures, puis j'aimerais connaître l'opinion de mon collègue ici à ma gauche. Le ministre des Affaires extérieures parlait du fait qu'il voulait mettre davantage d'emphase sur la déradicalisation en Syrie et en Irak. Et nous savons qu'ici même au Canada, les divers experts en sciences sociales qui se penchent sur ce phénomène de radicalisation chez les individus, que ce soit des politologues, des sociologues, des anthropologues ou des psychologues, disent que l'origine de la problématique est non déterminée encore et la solution pour enrayer ces problématiques-là est encore moins trouvée. Et donc, je demande à mon collègue qu'est-ce qu'il pense du fait que le ministre veut déradicaliser les gens dans une zone de combat, alors qu'ici même, on a la difficulté à le faire?
J'apprécie l'intervention, mais il faut adresser à la chaise et au président et non à la personne directe. Merci. The honourable member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague, the critic for Veterans Affairs, a veteran himself, for his comments. And, you know, radicalization is one of the things that I think every Canadian is worried about, as well as every member of the coalition, is that we have to stop the radicalization. That's why it's important that we work with community leaders here in Canada. If you look at where we've had the biggest success is where community leaders have actually engaged with policing agencies, with the government, on identifying those that are being radicalized and getting there first. But ultimately, the radicalization is being done by ISIS. And ISIS has a very aggressive marketing campaign, a very strong presence on social media, and are able to spread their hatred and their warped sense of religion. And so that is why, Madam Speaker, that we have to defeat ISIS so they can't go out there and spread their hate and attract our youth and attract foreign fighters to continue on with this war. So we have to crush the head of the snake.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My question to the honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman is whether or not members of his party have such a short memory that they do not recall the bombing of Libya. The bombing of Libya, which was insisted upon, and unfortunately I was the only member of Parliament to vote against the continued bombardment in June of 2011. But I recall the former Minister of Foreign Affairs in this place, the Conservative member of Minister of Foreign Affairs, saying, as the former government recognized the rebel forces in Libya as the legitimate government of Libya, as we took sides and decided they were the legitimate government of Libya, even though it included al-Qaeda forces, and said, well, we may not know what that government really will be, but we can be sure of one thing, John Baird said. They can't be worse than Muammar Gaddafi. A failed state now, a failed state where all the weapons flowed to terrorist groups. Bombardment is not the best way to bring peace. It never brings peace, and it fueled ISIS. Misunderstanding complexity is a threat to the region.
Honourable member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, Madam Speaker, I was very proud of the contributions that Canada, through the Royal Canadian Air Force and under the leadership of General Charles Bouchard, had done in the Libyan conflict. Now, you know, history is always 20/20, or, you know, we can always look back and see where we made mistakes. But I can tell you that the reason to go in there, and I appreciate the members' pacifism, but the reason to go in there was to protect, the responsibility to protect that I thought that all members of this House support, a United Nations value. And if we're going to go and make sure that, you know, Muammar Gaddafi in that situation was using sex as a weapon and was attacking, again, tribes in the outlying areas and was also threatening neighbors, he had to be taken out. And ultimately, we didn't follow through where we should have in stabilizing that region. And that's the reason that we need to have that whole government approach and destroy ISIS right now in Iraq and Syria so that it doesn't have the ability to continue to kill innocent civilians.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? Time for a very brief question. The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Briefly, Madam Speaker, I would like to congratulate my colleague for his speech. I prefer his tone than the tone of his leader. There is no excess in partisanship here. We have a disagreement about how we may be more effective in the coalition, but that's the key point. To take the analogy of the hockey team, Unfortunately, the Gretzky is not Canada, it's the United States. But Canada may play a great role in the team if we admit that and we focus on what the team needs the most. And when we are triple the training, doubling the intelligence capacity, and so on, it's why the reaction was good among our allies. And it's not that our airstrikes were not valuable, it's that there is no shortage of airstrike capacity in the coalition. But there is a terrible shortage of training and humanitarian assistance and development and counter-radicalization and so on.
A very brief answer from the member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
I maintain, Madam Speaker, that Canada has the capabilities to do it all and has the opportunity to leave the CF-18s in the fight. And I ask the Minister of Foreign Affairs to leave the CF-18s in the battle, because we have to be engaged. We have to stop this scourge on the place of the earth and ensure that the people of Iraq and Syria have the opportunity to benefit from our institutional building, our humanitarian and compassion that we are going to show them in the time going ahead. Thank you, Madam Speaker.